Everyone, good afternoon. I always like it when we start with a round of applause, but in the interest of time, in the interest of getting as much insight as we possibly can from the session, and to learn from our distinguished panel and guests here today, and also be respectful for the folks here with us on Zoom, I'm keen to get a start. It's a wonderful day here today at Harvard Business School. There's been some fantastic sessions this morning. The sun is shining outside as we speak. Harvard Crimson are about to beat their archenemy Dartmouth College in American football, about 500 yards away from here. So it's a good day to be at Harvard. We're going to spend just over the next hour or so with a panel conversation and a discussion looking at all aspects of bias in AI and how we can audit algorithms. So much of that plays into trust and safety, there's governance, there's ethical questions, but I'm really sort of keen to get straight to it. We'll structure the discussion with an introduction. Each of our three panelists will introduce themselves, explain a little bit about their background, where they're from, what their areas of expertise are, and then we will structure the rest of the discussion around governance and ethics and the due diligence that goes with all aspects of that. There will be opportunity to take questions from the room and from Zoom. Thanks so much for your participation. Let's get straight to it. Let's start, please, with Sarah, if you'd introduce yourself.
Great. I didn't know I was going first. So I'm Sarah Bird, and I have what I think these days is a very interesting job. I lead our responsible AI engineering effort at Microsoft. And what that means is, at Microsoft we say that well, basically, because what we found to be true in practice is the only way we can really do responsible AI is basically daily, very close collaboration across three legs of a stool. The first one being policy, which tells us what we're trying to achieve. Research shows us, what's possible and what we need to be looking out for. And then the part that I lead, engineering, is figuring out how to actually make that work in practice, make that practical for engineering practice, but also develop the production systems that are capable of doing that. And what we found over the last, now, many years of doing this is that actually with any one of these parts, if we're missing it, we just don't get to the right answer. We end up with policy that's not implementable, or we end up with engineering systems that don't achieve what we want, or we're missing, some new opportunity. And so it's been a really fun and interesting journey to bring these three together, figure out how they actually work together, and now really put them in practice at scale in generative AI. And I think we're going to talk about several important topics, so I'm super excited to share more on each of those. Maybe a little bit more about how my team works for context. So we are the team that goes and figures out when we get a new technology like GPT-4 last summer. We figure out, okay, how do we take this new technology and how do we make sure that we're developing it responsibly, but how do we also ensure that others are able to use it responsibly? And so the way that we do this, fortunate to be Microsoft, we're able to bring many experts together and look at how are we going to develop the first application. So we had many experts from around the company working full-time, for example, on Bing Chat. What we figured out for how to sort of work with GPT-4 there, we took all of that technology, we integrated it back in Azure, and now that powers all of the co-pilots in Microsoft, but is also something that our customers can use when they're developing with generative AI. So that's how we work, and through that we have learned a lot of different things along the way, which I'm happy to share.
Thanks so much. Priya.
Hi everyone, my name is Priya Iragavarapu. I'm the Vice President of Data Science and Analytics at AArete. AArete is a boutique consulting company headquartered in Chicago, and we help a lot of our clients primarily within the healthcare payer market and also in the financial services. And my job is to essentially help ideate solutions for their business problems in terms of technology, in terms of data, and create that analytics and data science methodology and to be able to get the work done and then go and deliver that work. That's essentially my job in a nutshell. And in the past, I've had a lot of deep financial service experience during my time at Amex and prior to that at US Bank as well. So with that, in my current role, as I told you, right, we're building a lot of Gen AI and data science, traditional machine learning models for the financial services industry and the healthcare payer industry, and a lot of that requires deep scrutiny, right? Why that is important is because these models that we are building, say risk stratification and segmentation modeling, segmentation is across the horizontal delineation, and stratification is the vertical delineation in terms of risk. And when we make that assessment, or the subsequent decisioning is following up with what kind of care we're going to give to the most needy and prioritizing the members and being able to deliver the work. So, and it is extremely imperative that those kind of models are treated with the due diligence needed in order to be able to give the right care to the right people and not alienate any particular section or group along the way. So these are some of the strong and critical models that we build, and that's why I'm actually very excited to be in this very smart and intelligent company, and I'm looking forward to sharing my thoughts on ethical AI governance and auditing the models.
Thank you. Anita.
Sure. Hi, everybody. I am actually excited to be here for a few different reasons. It's an amazing panel. I'm an HBS alum. I graduated from HBS 15 years ago and was just here in June for my reunion. So I'm excited to be able to come back and kind of give back in this way as well. And then also just to meet all of you. I hate talking about myself, so my introduction is going to be really brief. I have sort of 3 hats that I wear. I'm a former chief data officer. I think, not 100% sure because I don't think anyone's tracking, but I may have been the first African-American woman to be a chief data officer for a US public company. I also serve currently on several boards. Most of them are private, but the most prominent is NASDAQ US exchanges. And I also teach. So I teach in an MBA program out on the West Coast because it's too hard to come back and forth to Boston from California. But I've lived in New York, I've lived in Chicago. I'm originally from Chicago, I was actually born there, and I'm now currently based in the San Francisco Bay Area. But like I said, just quickly so I know who's in the room, how many of you actually deal with generating or producing some sort of AI or machine learning in their day-to-day work? Just show of hands. Okay.
Oh, that's terrific.
Yeah. And then how many of you are in charge of some sort of oversight for AI in their day-to-day? Okay. And how many of you are doing anything policy related to AI? Anybody in AI policy? Okay. Awesome. And then who's afraid of AI? Is anybody afraid of AI? All right. I think that's going to be a really good audience for our discussion. So
It certainly is, and it's great to see the blend of different areas of expertise, policy, operations, governance, and folks here involved in the product side as well. But let's jump straight into the governance aspect of it. I think this is often misunderstood. I think the broad need for it is agreed upon, but who would like to lead off with their thoughts around governance in terms of the structure, effective ways of doing it, maybe different methodologies? And will we have any thoughts on that?
Well, I do have a slide, but I don't know. Do you guys have slides?
We do too,
Yeah?
so
Okay.
just whatever.
Yeah. It's this one, actually, the one that's up in front of us. I don't know how to... yeah. So I'm sure other people here also have views that they can share, but for my sort of 2 cents on this, there's a great book by, I believe it's Reed Blackman, Ethical Machines. Has anybody read it? It's a great book. Yeah, I love that book. So I pulled a lot of my notes, kind of from some thoughts, personal experience, but also heavily I draw from that book. Structure and content for AI governance are really important. Most times when I am in the boardroom having conversations about AI, they tend to focus on structure. And by that I mean it's the who, the what, the when, and the how. So essentially the process for reviewing use cases for AI, regardless of whether they actually have sort of a statement on what the intended purpose, outcomes, what values, standards, what techniques, and the ethics kind of behind it. So I would encourage you to do both and really focus on not only how you're going to evaluate AI use cases, but also asking questions, is this something that we feel strongly is important to evaluate from an ethical perspective? And if so, what values do we hold as a company, and how are we going to weave those values and standards for those values into the process, and then assume at the outset that your AI is actually going to have some issues, and we're going to get into this, I think, a little bit later. In terms of risk management, I think it's pretty self-explanatory. There's reputational risk, there's litigation risk, there's regulatory compliance risk. Nobody wants to pay fines. Nobody wants to deal with any of the having to rebuild a brand and the costliness there. All of that is something to take into consideration. And then training. So I've seen very few governance programs that don't have some aspect of training. But if you're going to do training, I would also kind of circle back to the first point I was making, which is the training needs to be very values-based. If it's only use case-based, then you still sort of leave yourself open to organizationally having a lot of catching up to do, because people will just sort of run with whatever the cool new tool is and not give a second thought to how it might impact the organization or the ethical kind of risk mitigation that you need to be taking into account. That's my 2 cents.
Fantastic.
So I could tee off of that. One of the things that I have certainly, I don't need my slide though, but I can just talk it off. One of the things that I have noticed in the past and with various organizations that I work with is where you have the head of your model governance or AI governance report to, it does matter. It makes a huge difference. You need to make that person report to, say, a chief risk officer or someone on the risk side, as opposed to put them under the business leader. Then if you do that, then that is not a good recipe for success, because the goals of the business leader is going to be different. They are always in the growth mode, trying to get more revenue, increase the market share, whereas the governance leaders' goals are slightly orthogonal to that. So again, they all ultimately have to align without question. They cannot be in silos, but it's extremely important when you see at a larger scale where that, if you want to see how important governance is for, or model governance or AI governance is, or data governance is for an organization, look at their org chart, and that will immediately tell you where, how serious they are as an institution. And again, in healthcare world and in the financial services world, there's obviously a lot of regulations already available, even in HR and housing, right? There's a lot of regulation already available, and regulators will tell you that it is the Fair Housing Act or the Fair Credit Act, all of those are created as an end in sight. They are technology or tool or AI agnostic, so they still want to make sure that there is no bias against the protected classes. But one of the things that we see in the real world is that because there is always bias in data, and because of the fact that we cannot really train a model through the entire data set that is available, through the entire population, and we have to inevitably take a smaller sample set to be able to train our model, it is inevitable that we're leaving out some groups. And again, it not always is malicious, right? Sometimes it is inadvertent, and like how many left-handers in the room, right? Anyone who has opened a can opener or used a pair of scissors, you know that that product was not really made for you, right? It's that kind of elimination of certain groups that we inevitably see. And although there may not be regulation, or you may not be a protected class, but as an organization, as an enterprise, we definitely have to cater to all the communities, all the groups. And that, I think, is one of the things where individual organizations need to prioritize in terms of their ethical AI governance, which is so going a step above and beyond what is required by you to follow the law. So that's my 2 cents on it.
Excellent.
So I can add, if we can put up the slides for me. So our, this is something that we have been experimenting with for quite a few years now at Microsoft to figure out how to do for ourselves and make actually work in practice. And this is the little sort of one-slide summary. This is totally public, so you can go actually read our whole responsible AI standard. But this is the one-slide summary of the requirements for our standard. This is the version 2 of the standard. The first version of the standard, we, and I helped write both of them so I can, poke holes in them. But the first version of the standard was our best intent, and we said things like, you need to test your system for fairness, and you need to make it fair, more or less. We absolutely struggled in engineering with how do we implement that, right? It was telling you kind of the principle or the conceptual outcome, but not the procedural things to get there. And so a big part of the experience of making this practical for us has been breaking these down into very structured things. So for example, goal A1 is you have to do an impact assessment. Goal A2 is saying if your system is potentially higher impact, it needs to go through a panel of experts to provide, sort of additional oversight of that, right? And so similarly, we've broken down fairness into a couple different types, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more when we talk about testing. But this has been so key for us to actually make our sort of approach to governance effective in the company. And the other part of what we've really found, which we can get into more also with testing, is that it is still too difficult to successfully implement. Like we had our responsible AI reviewers and champs and things in the organizations, and the teams wanted to do these, but it actually still takes a lot of expertise to implement any of these particular things if you're doing it for the first time. And so this is where we've ended up with a more centralized team that is actually invested a huge amount in like testing infrastructure and pre-built testing and things so that teams can actually test for quality of service fairness effectively. Because the journey to build that test involves, significant like external expertise, significant data investment, all of that. And so for us, it was relatively straightforward to have the chief, our chief responsible AI officer to sort of build out that governance infrastructure, but it wasn't sort of effective in driving the implementation until we had this bridging thing of the policy, and a policy that was clear enough for it to be repeatable across products so that we can start building that into tools and building that into engineering practice. The other point I thought that might be interesting, if we go to the next two slides, through our experience, we talk so much about the model or just sort of AI conceptually, and through our experience, I think what we've also learned is that you need to do different things at different levels of the ecosystem, and this is not, shouldn't be a surprising thing to say in terms of, the supplier of a pre-trained model is going to be different than the application developer, and that's different than the end user. But this is sort of how we see the technology stack for foundational AI models, right? And so there's actually a bunch of important points that we need to think about governing in here. First you're starting with the AI data center, and with the infrastructure, right? The amount of investment we've had to build these AI supercomputers that can train these large-scale models, have enough data flow quickly enough, have enough compute power, right? We're literally building new data centers to support, new types of data centers to support this. That means you can build any model you want, right? And so then, since that is the riskiest and most powerful thing, and then you've got the technologies like GPUs, which have been very much in the public lately, that enable this to actually go. And then running all of that, you end up with a very powerful pre-trained model, like GPT-4 that I mentioned earlier, that can be used for many, many purposes, many different applications. So that's a huge amount of sort of investment and value there. And then, of course, on top of that, there's how do you access that developer interface on top of that and the complete application. And if you go to the next slide, what we found in our experiences is it is a very different thing to think about how we should govern each of these. And so this was, Brad, I was there with Brad in DC a couple of months ago in May when he sort of laid this as a proposal of one way you could think about each of these layers. But at the lower, more flexible layer, we need to know like who's doing this and why are they doing this. At the pre-trained layer, you need to have built-in safety and security so that people who are building on top of it can be successful. You need to know who is using this for what purposes. And then at the application level, thinking about governing that more like the domain, right? The health application is already going to be governed by existing healthcare regulations. Maybe those need to be modernized. Maybe the new things need to be added for AI. But the domain matters so much there, and so you should think about it that way. And so this is sort of the kind of what we had proposed. But this is built very much on our experiences where when we're developing our Azure AI platform system that's offering all of these foundation models, the tools and technologies we need to develop are about ensuring that our system is not being misused, but then also enabling those above us to build safe applications successfully, right? And to be able to have all the tools and all the information they need so that they can build a complete application that works well. And so it's very different to do each of these. And when we've seen, in some cases, a lot of the energy is now just focused on what the model can do, but ultimately a huge amount of the impact is going to come from the applications and how they behave in all of these different domains.
Excellent. Thanks so much. So in the interest of time, let's move on to the next topic that we want to discuss, and we'll hold more than enough time at the end to revisit any questions there may be. Specifically with regards to the ethical side of the discussion, let's pivot the conversation there. How do we approach some of those challenges? How do we maybe tell the story of what those ethical challenges are, especially to senior leadership, whereby the C-suite may not be technologists. They may not genuinely understand the operational side of those challenges or the policy side of those challenges. What thoughts might we have on how we approach the ethical considerations? Who would like to take that?
I can take a first stab at it. So when I communicate to C-suite about the ethical concerns, right, there are two scenarios and conditions which arise, and these are pertinent to the models that we use. Right? One is the generalization challenge, where you won't have the representation of all of the groups that you need to include in that. It maybe your model works only for certain groups because of the way the data is compiled or leveraged. So how do we make sure, have that conversation about how do we ensure that your AI model is generalizable across all groups? The second challenge with AI is pertinent to the inaccuracy in how you are actually training it. There are sets of people who probably don't have access to access to healthcare, so they may not be getting enough screenings done. Therefore, some of their data is devoid of the data set that we have leveraged in doing that analysis, right? So in that terms, because of that gap, there are also challenges in terms of what that output will be. So when we look at ethical AI, we look at these two possibilities of identifying what are the groups that have been left out and what is that ratio. And again, when you take a smaller sample and when you have a larger population, how do you make sure that your sample is in alignment with the larger population? Run those tests to make sure that your sample is representative of the larger population that you need to use, and then identify, and essentially we create a RACI matrix for building the ethical governance or test cases or use cases, where we say who is responsible for identifying what are the areas that are missing, that need to be important. Again, this is a consideration that needs to be taken care of pertinent to each model that we put in front of the C-suite. So who's responsible, who's accountable, who's communicated or consulted and informed. So we build out this RACI matrix and then start populating what are the ethical plugins or gaps that we identify for that particular AI model, and we'll start developing those in that kind of a governance setting. And that is extremely important. And we also have, again, we're a consulting company, so we help organizations build this out. And I was actually sharing this to one of the fellow attendees here, which is we work as audits for model audits for our clients, and when our clients' teams build their models, we work as the reverse. When we build models, we have our clients' team be the audit as well, and together there's always our leadership and the client C-suite folks who are in those conversations, identifying, asking these hard questions, and we will inform those gaps where there could be ethical challenges, and you need a diverse areas of expertise at the table to be able to communicate all of this and effectively drive home the point.
Okay, thank you. One follow-up question, if I may. Do you, based on your experience, do you find that there are certain industries or certain size of companies that can navigate those ethical challenges better than others, or is everybody pretty much at the same state?
The former. There are obviously, I think that you know the answer to the question, right? Obviously the superscalers, they exactly know how to do it. They can take thousands of people from one area to the other and have them focus on it. So they're called superscalers for a reason. But in general, larger organizations have a tendency to think through in a 360. We see these challenges where sometimes there needs to be that cross company collaboration and governance, but sometimes which needs to happen, but not necessarily it happens. So obviously, it's not a sales pitch, but that's where you leverage consulting companies to be able to come in and help you fill the gap within your organization where that gap is.
Thank you. Anita, I'd love to hear your thoughts on all aspects of the ethical challenges, please.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, maybe Jenny, if you could help me out and pull up the slide. And while she's doing that, I asked the question earlier about who's afraid of AI. And so many of us in the room are practitioners, and yet we're also at the same time afraid of it. Can I ask someone to introduce for me maybe like one or two reasons why, small or big, why they said they're afraid of AI? Yeah, go ahead, Sava.
First one is misinformation and disinformation and the evolution of that. So that's principally number one.
Yeah.
And the second one is in some practical implementations that we've had where we have clusters of agents communicating to each other, you see like spots of like really weird like AGI kind of stuff.
Right. You don't know what it's doing.
We're coming very close.
Yeah.
To some of this work that is going to kind of get out of hand.
Yeah. So I would say that maybe, I agree with many of the points that you made, but I think one point that I don't necessarily agree with is I actually don't think that any of us really have this figured out, for the very reason that many of us who are practitioners are still kind of grappling with the when do we turn it off? And misinformation and disinformation. How do we reconcile the fact that a technology that we have created can, even with the best of intentions from its creators, still be capable of doing things that are unethical by the definition of the people who created it, right? And we are not fully, I think, able to understand, if you radically simplify what's happening, it's pattern recognition, but we don't always understand on what basis those patterns are being identified by the technology and then used as screening criteria to make decisions that are going to impact, to your point, they're going to impact populations of people, and possibly in negatively discriminatory ways, in unethically discriminatory ways. These are real concerns. And so in order to address that, you have to start out with that in mind and actually come up with, because often these things are being used to develop solutions that are going to impact people at scale, you also have to have processes that are going to operate at scale to intervene both before deployment and after. And so we've talked, I think, some of the things that happen, before deployment. After deployment, I think there's a lot more risk mitigation involved. But ultimately, thinking through what are we going to actually test for. It's great to understand what mechanisms are there to test, so we can have fairness metrics, we can have accountability, assessments, we can have experts come in and tell us like what are the things that we should be thinking about. But if you don't fundamentally have a sense for like what are our values as an organization, what do we believe is our mission, and then how does this technology help us to further that mission, and what is our responsibility as an organization to foresee problems and then proactively take steps to mitigate that risk, both before and after deployment. Those are all, I think, some of the key questions. I've talked about a lot of the points on the slide already, but I'm going to squint here and try to read it. I think ultimately, algorithms, because we know that they are fallible, and we ourselves as human beings are fallible, we don't have the ability to always see the impacts and the consequences of the choices that we're making. The more heads, collaborating on the solution, the better. But also understanding that when you're doing your testing, you don't just want to test for correct behavior or expected behavior on a data set that is kind of predictable. So for example, if you were doing something in mortgage lending and you have a set of data that represents, okay, these are the people that historically have gotten mortgages and these are the people who have not. And so if this algorithm is working correctly based on the training data, then it should give a predictable response. But we all know that, at least in the US, like mortgage lending systems have been historically flawed and biased. And so that correct behavior is actually, if you're trying to make an improvement with this technology, it may not be ethical depending on the organization that you're representing. So having a clear sense of where you're trying to go as a company, as a firm, as an organization, what impact you're trying to have on the world, and then your ethical standards don't necessarily reflect beliefs. Like we're a very sort of politically polarized country right now. I strongly believe that is also creating a very high risk environment for developing AI technologies, because people have differing sort of beliefs about what is the right way to approach certain things. You can think about when you talked about misinformation, different people define misinformation with a different lens. And so understanding how to try to salvage sort of fact in the midst of so much kind of noise. Like human beings are struggling to do this, so how can we really expect AI to do it? So being able to answer those questions and be transparent about the standards and where your technology may actually be flawed, I think is also something that we are grappling with. And the reason why we grapple with it is because we're also in the US a very litigious society. But I think that transparency is something that's key. So those are the main points I would hit on. Like, I think you cannot really have an ethical standard unless you really understand the values of the organization and have a sort of North Star that goes beyond what a belief set may represent. And beliefs can be very temporal, by the way. What we believe today is not what we believed 30 years ago. Just watch any 90s sitcom and you'll be shocked at what we thought was okay. Even that short time ago, and then ultimately having the courage to recognize that nothing is going to be flawless, and that everything is going to inherently have a challenge, but acknowledging that and being transparent about how you're actively working to constantly reevaluate and mitigate those challenges, I think is probably a good place to start.
And so I think to answer your first question of what do you do about sort of like leadership that doesn't understand the risk? I don't think there's any answer that isn't you have to educate them, right? I have spent a fair amount of time teaching Microsoft's leadership what a jailbreak is, for example, and it's important that they know and they understand, and also what it's not, or what hallucination is, or any of the new words we're all using, right? Like, you ultimately, like, the company leadership does need to understand these risks, but they also need to understand both like the measurement and the mitigations as well, right? You need to really understand, kind of, at least at a high level, all of the parts that are in play. And when I think about kind of the bigger topic here of ethical or responsible use of technology, I was hoping to show an example of one of the earlier sensitive AI technologies that we developed at Microsoft that I think was really instructive in sort of my own thinking about how we need to do this, because, as I've said before, there's so much focus on like just the model and the training data, but if we think about the responsible use of technology, it's not just the responsible development, it's also the responsible use. And so if we can pull up the slides, I don't need to show you any of the demo because I think you all saw the video editing earlier, but this is, if you can just start on, you can still start on the first slide and we can go. One of the first sensitive AI technologies that we shipped sort of more recently in our responsible AI era is what we call our custom neural voice technology. And this is an API that enables you to make highly realistic synthetic versions of people's voices, and we already saw some great examples of that. As you can see now, the technology is fantastic. In fact, these samples are a little out of date, and so they're going to like sound not as good compared to where it is today. The technology enables a bunch of very interesting use cases. One of my favorites is actually what's on the bottom here, which is translation, right? So now Eric Boyd is my leader, by the way, but like now he also speaks Italian and he does not speak Italian, right? And so like the ability to hear someone speaking in your language in their native voice, I think just brings another level of connection, but also for real-time translation and stuff, we can actually now have video calls where you can be speaking in English and listening in German or something, which is pretty amazing in the actual voices. So technology is pretty compelling, but I've never had any, especially I'm sure in this room, as soon as you talk about this, people are thinking exactly, misinformation, disinformation, all sorts of concerns. And so when we sat down and said, okay, what do we need to think about? We did an impact assessment, that goal A1 in our standard, and said, okay, what do we need to do with this technology? There's kind of two things that really pop. And so if you go to the next slide here, one of them is
our customers like the idea of communicating with their customers.
Anyway, we had to think about how are we going to protect listeners from misleading content and experiences that can now be created. But we also have to think about how are we going to protect speakers from having their voices, impersonated or improperly used. And there's other considerations as well, but this is a sort of simplified version, so I can illustrate a point. So we went to work and said, what are we going to do about this, right? And there is no one single fix for this. This is not like an algorithmic change. This is something where we had to also think deeply about how we sell the technology, all of that. And so I'm going to show you some of the different mitigations that we've kind of developed basically to kind of address this through the experience of what is it like when you're using this technology. So the first thing is this was actually I think you can go to the next slide. This is actually the first technology at Microsoft that in AI that we made limited access. So we said that this technology, although it is general purpose, we don't want it to be used for all use cases. There's actually, in fact, a lot of legitimate use cases that we don't support. We have said this is where we think the technology works well, and the trade-offs are sort of in the right zone for responsible use of the technology. And so customers need to apply to use this technology. We work with trusted customers for a limited set of use cases. And so they first fill out an application form. The next thing that happens when they're approved, if you can go to the next slide, is that they're going to go and collect training data, and for that they're going to need to have a voice talent that they want to use. And the voice talent here is such a key part, right? If we're thinking about protecting the speaker, they need to be able to understand what they're signing up for. And so we worked with voice talents and user researchers to actually build an explainer doc for voice talent, what this technology is, how it works, all of that. And we require that our customers give this to their voice talents. Once you've collected the training data, then you're going to go into the training portal, you're going to train, so you can go to the next slide. And you train a bunch of
To hide all
sentences
portable
like this,
possessions
but we can skip the audio. And then the next thing you do is you're going to build this voice. And so we wanted to ensure that the voice talent really was involved in this. And so as part of this, if you go to the next slide, we asked the voice talents to upload a audio file that's saying that they understand that they're having a synthetic voice made of theirs, and we match that to the training data of the voice. And so the training will actually fail if there's not a voice match using our speech recognition technology. And then if you go to the next slide, so here it's failing. If we were listening to the audio, we would hear the voices don't match, and then it's succeeding here, and then you can go to the next. So then the next part here is that, okay, but that, and so that's starting to make sure the speaker's involved, they understand. This is people who are trusted entities building voices. But now we also have to empower the users, right? And so part of this is not, just what the technology can do, but how it's built into the application. And so we've been developing, we require that customers either disclose that the voices are synthetic or that it's contextually obvious. If you're making a character, for example, it's pretty straightforward. And so we've been working with different customers of ours to develop design patterns for disclosure so that customers can have a pattern to start with of how might they actually make this synthetic part obvious to listeners. So this is another part of what you think about when you're integrating the technology. And then if we go to the next thing, of course, the whole time customers must follow our code of conduct. The voice must not be used to be, misleading people, making content authoritative that wasn't, all of that. And we audit for following of our code of conduct, and we have the ability to shut users down or customers down for if they're violating it. And then finally, and this is an ongoing thing, so there's more coming over time. But we've developed a new type of watermarking in the technology where the technology. The audio has our watermark, so we can detect any synthetic audio that's been coming from our system, so that if there is an incident where the technology has sort of been used to misrepresent something in the world, we can at least say, yes, this was our technology, right, and this is developing a new watermark for that. And so this is all just about sort of responsible use of technology. This is not talking about other work that we've had to do to ensure that we represent all types of voices well, different types of people with different types of speech disabilities, or how do we represent, or should we represent voices as not readily identifiable as male or female, or other things of just making sure it works well. And so there's so much, right, to doing this for one of these particularly more sensitive technologies. And so you actually need your leaders to understand all of this and to understand that the tools are policies on how you sell the technology, new technological innovation in watermarking, and just documents so that people understand and are informed, right? And so understanding that thinking through these challenges is really an interdisciplinary thing across all of these dimensions too, that you can't just say, oh, add a watermark and then it's fine, right? And then all of these, you might still need more on top of that, but that's a big part of it too, is that and this is why I said earlier that we found that we can't do this with just policy or just engineering, just research, because doing one of these involves all of those dimensions to figure out what are the different pieces we can put together to actually figure out how to do this. So that's my example I wanted to show with my time slot here.
That's fascinating. Thanks so much. It's remarkable to see how quickly the technology has progressed. Thank you for the insight. In terms of the final part of the discussion before we move to questions, what other thoughts might we have with regards to due diligence and testing? What would represent best practice? How would we see the diligence or the test environment improving in the future as the technology continues to improve? What thoughts might anyone have on that, please?
I can start, since my slides are already up. So a couple thoughts. So first of all, for me at least, like, testing is huge. That is actually where we've put like an enormous amount of our innovation energy to figure out how to test these systems, to test them at scale, to test them in repeatable ways. Because that, like, once you've identified an issue and quantified an issue, and the testing is also what enables you to start figuring out how to fix it, right? But that's when you start driving all the right things, because at least what we find is that, you know, teams and leaders do actually rightly view a lot of these things as product defects, and so once you have a test to show that that defect's there, they do want to fix it, right? But when there's no test, it's more of a theoretical argument. Could this be a problem or something? And so I wanted to show just a couple things here. So these are our 3 fairness goals of our responsible AI standards. So you saw them earlier, but this has been really important in our thinking about testing, because what this says is there are 3 different types of ways that an AI system could behave unfairly, or dimensions that it needs to behave fairly. So this is not talking about the bigger impact of the use of the technology. This is the behavior of the AI system. So this is things we need to test for. And the first one here, F1, quality of service fairness, is saying that the AI systems need to be equally accurate for different groups of people. And so when we're building a test for that, for example, we built a test, testing our speech-to-text system, so our system there. We had to work with experts to say, okay, what are all the different ways speech can vary? What are the different properties of speech? What are the different connections? Like, do we need to think about education? Do we need to think about gender, age, like also sociolectal language varieties, all of that. And so, then we have to sort of quantify what does it mean and what are the dimensions you can vary, build out those test sets, build the testing, build the metrics to look for like quality of service. Now, F2 is a very similar type of fairness. We test reasonably close, but this is saying that systems that are involved in allocating resources or opportunities need to do that fairly. And it's not quite the same thing as accuracy. You could have a system that's choosing to allocate loans in a certain way that maybe is accurate to the underlying data in some dimension, but it's not actually driving the outcome that we want. And so there you're testing the decision the system is making, which is a little different than testing the accuracy. The last one, which is where we're spending all of our time right now in Gen AI land, but applies to many other systems as well, is how people are represented in the AI system. So is the AI system, when it's making a statement or generating an image or bringing up photos or bringing up information, how is it representing people? Is it representing them in a way that's stereotyping or demeaning? Is it over-representing one group or under-representing another or erasing a group? And the way you test for this is just totally different. It's just completely different. But now that we've broken each of these down, we're actually able to start building that testing plan and the testing tools and the data sets and all of that. And so this has been really key for us to figure out how to test them. Is you have to start figuring out what is the repeatable thing you're testing for, and then how do you actually start building out that testing. So then I wanted to share just a little bit about where we are thinking in like generative AI and with this. So if you go to the next slide, one of the things, a big topic now is red teaming, right? And if folks aren't familiar with red teaming, we're now using this term fairly generally, but it's sort of this manual probing of systems. It could be adversarial probing, which is kind of what red teaming historically was. You also now see just standard stress testing or people testing in normal kind of usage. But this is a way we test very heavily now, bringing together many different types of experts, looking when we're going through a production system. The red team is going there, so we try to target them at areas we think we don't have as robust of testing. We look at the results after a week of what they found, and we take that information and we figure out how do we expand our test sets? Why is the red teamers finding this but our automated testing isn't finding it? We also use it to figure out where do we need to close gaps in the product, and we iterate over and over again. And red teaming, there's huge discussion now, lots of people asking how do you build a red team, and it's been a really key tool for closing the gaps. But this doesn't actually help you drive fixes. You don't really know how bad a problem is if you have sort of some manual testing of it. You don't know the scale and the scope. And so if you go to the next slide, the other big part for us has been ongoing evaluation. And so this is really the heart of what we've had to do, is take experts to define like what is the harm or the risk or the thing you want to test for, like those 3 fairness examples. Create the inputs, right? We've actually found that's a very expert task, to create the inputs that exercise that harm. then you have to generate the system outputs. So for example, in generative AI, we've actually had to build systems that simulate user interaction so that they can role play a jailbreak, for example. And then finally, you need to evaluate that output so that you can get a metric. So you can know, are you failing 10% of the time or 2% of the time or more? And this is actually where we've had huge breakthroughs with generative AI, because evaluating these different types of harms, like just looking at an example and being able to score it, that was something we could only do with like expert humans. So for example, our hate speech guidelines are like 20 pages long and take expert linguists. We've actually been able to get GPT-4 to score those reasonably effectively compared to humans. And so that means what a test cycle that used to take 2 weeks or more now can be run in 1 day, right? And so the amount that we can test and iterate, and so it's just unlocked like a crazy amount of responsible AI innovation in what we can try when we have that testing. And so that is a long thing to say. To me, testing is one of the most important things. It makes everything else easier. And so if you like only do one thing well, do testing well.
Thank you. Firstly to Anita and then to Priya before we move to questions. What final thoughts, insights or best practice might you have with regards to testing and due diligence?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with a lot of what Sarah said. I think ultimately I found the example terrifying because
the
it's great.
Voice.
Yeah, but it's great, but it's terrifying because the average person is not going to be able to discriminate between sort of, their president, being on some sort of, if the fake is good enough and if this technology is something that Microsoft can produce, then others can also produce it, and they don't have the same safeguards in place. And so I think we can all imagine, there was that radio show that sort of pretended, what was it, that aliens were invading the Earth, or that
War of the Worlds, I think.
Yeah, and things like that. Like, we are humans, and some of us are not all well intended, and so the fact that some of these things exist, I think, is a challenge. On the due diligence and testing side, I think from an ethical lens, before you get into the nitty-gritty of all of this, you need to just sort of have leaders that are not afraid to ask, is this something that we should create? Does this need to exist? And if it does need to exist from a defense perspective, because we have nuclear missiles, because other countries have nuclear missiles, that sort of line of thinking, where does the sort of AI equivalent of the nuclear arms race ultimately take us, right? Like, what kind of a world are we living in? So don't be afraid to ask, do we want to work for companies that are willing to do certain things with the technology? Do we feel good about that? And don't be afraid to ask or expect leaders to ask those same questions. Do we want to buy companies that are capable of producing these things, and what was the intended use? How well guarded has it been? How well can we guard against, misuse of this technology? And I mean, I think, companies, more money is flowing through corporate entities than governments in this world right now. But leaders of companies are not elected, right? So, and they change. Boards fire CEOs or CEOs resign on a daily basis. So understanding sort of where we're heading and asking those questions, I think, is in this room, collective responsibility as the people who are, even if we don't totally, to Sava's point, understand everything that's happening, and when do you turn it off? When do you recognize that the trade-off, for competitive advantage versus sort of, what is the right thing to do? When do you recognize when to turn it off?
Yeah, and I just want to add, we have sort of restricted use. We have what we view as unsuitable uses of AI, and we have chosen as a company to say, we will not do this. I think it's a super important conversation to have, and we, I think, announced last summer that we canceled some of our facial recognition features for that reason, that we felt it wasn't a suitable use of AI. And so I think that's something every organization needs to do is say, like, where are the boundaries that this is something that we do not want to be doing?
Yeah.
And then I was showing an example of something we are doing, then the question was more of the how to do it.
Yeah.
But yeah.
But don't get me wrong, I'm a capitalist. Like, I went to HBS. I started out saying that. So I'm not saying that, like, we don't need to create competitive advantage or compete, because we desperately need to be competitive in this space. But we also need to be responsible with it, right? And so, yeah.
There are certainly many challenges, both from the technological perspective, but also the commercial and the public policy challenges as well. I think that's a fascinating discussion, perhaps for another day. Priya, any final thoughts before we move to questions?
Yes, absolutely. I'd like to get my slide up if possible. I definitely, I do not deal with these kind of generative AI use cases of creating voice or video. But if you go to I believe the last slide. So yeah, if you can pause here. So the obviously the most important part of your entire model building process is the testing. A lot of times people do everything that is in gray, like you do your exploratory data analysis, the training the model, then testing, validation, and then you straight go to deployment. But then there is that QA for bias is something, or the testing for bias or for ethical concerns is something that we don't really pay much attention to. We did a poll and we found out that less than 10% are actually doing that step as data scientists. And so it is something that is skipped in most of your, if you look at the data science scrums, this step is 100% skipped. Maybe there is high level discussion in terms of what are the use cases, how do we build it, are we using the right data? There is that kind of discussion that goes on in enterprises, but when it comes to the model building perspective, that QA for ethical testing and bias is actually skipped by most. And so I kind of laid out some of the bias testing techniques that we can leverage, and those are something that are 100% definitely possible in your model building, where you're really trying to look at each group and making sure that there is not a difference in just by perturbing just one attribute, your output or your prediction doesn't change drastically. So those are some of the analysis that you can do to determine what are the right level of testing techniques you can employ. And then if you go to the next slide here, again, with respect to, and now this is something that I do, again, it goes back to your process of the feedback loop, right? The way I call it is, you test for bias, and if you find out that bias does exist, then you adjust for bias. And so that's one of the things that we do frequently is we know all data is biased. The model that you train will be biased. Now, the only good thing that comes out of this is you can test for bias successfully, and you can then adjust for bias. And how do you adjust by? You can resample, you can do undersampling for the more prominent class, and you can do oversampling for the underrepresented. So there are some techniques, as I laid out here, that you can leverage to then adjust and fix for that bias and fairness. There are also some out-of-the-box tools that are available, like Fairkit-Learn. It's kind of an extension of Scikit-Learn that you can use to do some of these fairness testing. Again, what this is essentially just, is a tool and the technique. The use case and the test case is something your organization need to bring to the table. And that is when you have to have that conversation to identify this is what the model is doing. These are the underrepresented or groups that are not essentially being represented in the model correctly, and what is the adjustment I need to make, why I need to make that adjustment, and then have that consensus across the board when you then go to deployment. And I think that is something that is missing in a lot of our frameworks, and that's extremely key and important.
And organizations don't plan for it. They don't plan for the investment or the time. Teams are like, it's done. I want to ship it tomorrow. And as you said,
Yes.
it's an iterative cycle. You test, you find things you have to fix. And so organizational leaders need to actually plan for that testing, investment, both development and the time to do that.
Great. Let's move on to some questions. We've got a hard stop at 3:30, but I'm sure we can get a few in before then. Gentleman here on the right-hand side. Yes, please.
Thank you for your comments. I'm on a few boards, and probably other people out here, and I'm sitting here thinking, is there an atlas or a directory of the types of bias that we should be asking about? I mean, literally, what's the hate speech? Because I think if I, in other words, hate speech, what people think is offensive varies a lot.
Yeah.
So is there a compendium of hate speech, and is there I'm asking this in a really honest way.
Yeah, no. It's
And also the no use cases, like what are the red light, green light, yellow light use cases? Is there such a thing?
So
Anita, do you
yeah, I mean, so I'll start. I mean, I tend to think of things broadly from the board perspective. I think it depends. Your questions will depend on the organization that you're working for and sort of how. So if you start from the perspective of what would be a disaster in terms of how this could be misused or impact people in a negative way relative to the impact, like to what we're trying to accomplish as a company, start there. Because you're right, any individual will have their own definition and boundaries as far as what is deemed offensive language. And so there won't be any sort of data set that you can buy to say, here's a training data set for hate speech. Basically do what you need to do with it.
There are open source benchmarks for
But-
some of these, and you do have to adjust the labels for your organization. But there are open source benchmarks.
I'm not saying they don't exist. What I'm saying is, how effective are they really to getting to so you can.
It is helpful to have something to crib from, even if it's not perfect, though, right? Because then it's easier to react and say, I don't agree with this, than have to develop it from scratch. Right?
Yes, but yeah.
Boards want to be able to turn to something and say, we used and relied on this. Microsoft
Yeah.
gave
Yes.
us this wonderful list, and we incorporated that into everything we do. They also gave us the red light, green light, yellow light
Yeah.
on the use cases.
And
So we follow the Microsoft standard. Has anyone done that?
yeah, and I think so. I think you're right. And what we've found, even in our own company, is doing it first is really, really hard. It takes a lot more expertise to figure out how to do it from scratch. And so that's one of the reasons, even the responsible AI standard I was showing you, it's actually a very long document. We published it, and we're not saying it's perfect, but just so hey, if this is helpful for you. And so we're trying to publish and put as much as we can sort of out there, but also a lot of other great people are doing that as well, right? There's top conferences in these areas. And I have seen actually lots of great consulting organizations start pulling them together. Here's the top risk for generative AI you need to worry about. So there's no, for any one of these, there's no canonical list, but I think in the responsible AI ecosystem, there's a really healthy culture of very openly putting things out there so that others can learn, or so we can get feedback, so you can tell us, why aren't you thinking about that, or this thing, our version works better, right? We definitely want that. And so there just needs to be more, right? There needs to be more of that and more conversation around it.
Yeah, and let me just quickly add on. I'm not saying that I don't think these things should exist. What I'm trying to say is that it's not going to protect you from the board perspective from a lawsuit just because you followed a standard that Microsoft started or any other company started. What you need to have is a set of standards that dictate sort of how often are you updating and how committed are you to improving and keeping up with the standards that do exist. So there is a difference between, so for example, most companies I've seen equate privacy protection to anonymization. But anonymization, while it's necessary, is not fully sufficient to do what you need to do to protect privacy. So the contrast I'm trying to make is that it's still a moving target. It's an ever-evolving landscape, and boards need to be cognizant of both sort of where is the current benchmark for what we need to do today, but also how do we continuously improve what we are doing today so that we can keep up with sort of where the technology is going.
Thank you. Let's try and get one more question.
One more.
Over here, please.
Yeah.
Sorry, the lady behind you.
Hi, I'm a student at HBS and I'm researching AI.
Oh.
Academic work to some of the business use cases.
Yeah.
And I struggle because from what I've read and learned, there is no universal definition of fairness.
Yeah.
And some of them even conflict with each other.
Yes.
So I wonder, like, where do you go from here? Anita, you talked about sort of taking a values-based approach and thinking about the North Star.
Yeah.
And Priya, you talked about all these different techniques to test. But I guess I just wonder, are firms and management teams even equipped to do this? And if not, like, what do they do? Do they outsource to consultants? Do they sort of, are there technologies that are trying to automate this? Like, what is the process for thinking about fairness in your organization and trying to understand, like, what you should actually do about it?
So I think we all are trying to argue for more investment in this space. And the greatest framing of that is how much is it going to cost? How many hundreds of millions or tens of millions or millions of dollars will it cost to build our brand again if we have a trust violation, with our customers? I think most companies are not, this is just my personal opinion, I think most companies are not necessarily equipped with talent because anecdotally, there's probably 9 times more demand for people with data and data-related skill sets at any given company at any given time than there is supply in the pipeline. And so if you take that and then complicate it with just sort of everyone's kind of individual perspectives and views on these topics, you're not going to be able to get to alignment. I think the approach that Sarah was mentioning earlier is very helpful. Having some sense of where are the industry benchmarks for what is the best that we can do today, but still having that North Star for how do we continue to get better.
On your specific question, I'll give my personal answer from my experience. I definitely, was part of the fairness community, and we followed all of the 31 definitions, however many, half a day over time. And in practice, that has not been an issue, because I think actually what Anita was saying about what are you trying to achieve? When you sit down and the reason there's so many definitions is because in different settings, a different one's going to apply. And so when you look at the exact application and you're like, this is the way we want the system to behave for this application, one or two sort of more naturally fit, and then it's about actually implementing that. And so that matching, and that's even where I was saying the 3 types of fairness, we use different metrics for quality of service and allocation. But if a system's doing allocation is what applies. If the most important thing is the system works equally well for different groups of people, then those quality of service type metrics apply. And so generally it's a little mix of which is the one that aligns with what you're trying to achieve in that system, and then what ones are actually effective in getting that kind of outcome. Because at the point, a lot of the metrics are about the technical implementation and the algorithm, right? And so I've maybe been surprised in hindsight how little time I've spent thinking about how many different types of fairness there are when we're doing it in practice, when you sort of follow the academic literature.
Yeah, one thing, can I add something?
Yeah.
One thing I would add, though, is I understand Anita's perspective in terms of why what you said really answers the why you need to do that.
Yeah.
But in terms of what we need to do for determining those benchmarks that you need to for fairness, my response as an engineer, I'm putting on the engineer hat, comes from the point of data. So if you observe data across period of time, and if you are able to go back and determine, and again I'm going back to my own risk stratification and pop health use cases where we have to make sure that there is equitable priority given to the needy, right, in terms of healthcare dispense. So in terms of that, the way I always look at it is look at all of the data and then go back and reevaluate, not just in terms of accuracy, but in terms of fairness. Did we do the right thing 3 years ago, 4 years ago, 5 years ago? And then look at the data and enable that to tell us whether that was a fair means. Again, it's not something that we would, proudly disclose, but it is something definitely that would help us be geared towards kind of provide us a feedback loop to determine what kind of fairness metrics we should have determined back then, and kind of give you that perspective. That's really how I would start if there is not already a certain specific metrics that you're targeting or you already have.
And can I say one more
Please.
thing? My grandmother used to say that, when we know better, we do better. And so I think at some point in the future, maybe a decade from now, we'll look back at what we're doing now and realize sort of where there were gaps. But while we may not collectively agree on everything up here as a panel, I think we collectively are here because it is so important that you're thinking about these topics. And if you take away one thing, I think it's that it's so important to invest and to make sure that your companies are investing in these areas as well.
I 100% agree with
And to
that.
continue the dialogue there.
Yeah. And continue the external dialogue, and you can't skip the investment, right?
Yeah.
And maybe leaders in the space can help lessen the investment for the whole ecosystem, but frankly, every organization has to invest individually.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, folks, unfortunately, we're at time today, but thank you so much to Sarah, to Priya, to Anita for a fascinating discussion. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.